What's good? It's Woog. I just wanted to pose a question. Does Outkast have the most consistent body of work, catalog-wise, of any rap artist ever? And what I mean by this is album for album for album. Do they have the overall highest quality per album, basically where there is not one miss in that catalog? And I was thinking about this because I knew as their career was taking place that they were on a remarkable run where every album that they released seemed to, in some way or another, outdo the one before it. Now, I get it. A lot of people still love their debut the most, Southernplayalisticadillacmuzik. A lot of people love Aquemini. I would say most Outkast fans, if asked the question, would probably say Aquemini is their best album. That's my favorite Outkast album. But when you went from Southern Playalistic to ATLiens to Aquemini to Stankonia to finally Speakerboxxx, The Love Below, the double-sided album, I'm not going to count the Idlewild soundtrack. I'm talking about the albums that had equal participation between Andre and Big Boy. There was always something that was evolving with the group album over album. So, ATLiens was a little bit more eccentric than Southern Playalistic. Southern Playalistic, they were still just breaking out of this, out of the South. It has more of a Southern sound. It was almost a little indistinguishable between an Outkast album and that first Goody Mob album, Soul Food, which I love that album, by the way. I love Goody Mob's second album, Still Standing, maybe even more, arguable. But by the time they got to Aquemini, they were pretty much transformed into a much more eccentric group. They were experimenting with more sounds. You had songs like Spodioty, Dopalicious, and Liberation. That's the one with Erykah Badu and CeeLo. Spodioty, Dopalicious is the one with that that, kind of iconic melody line. And then obviously when you get to their next album, Stankonia, you've got, some of their biggest hits like Miss Jackson and So Fresh, So Clean. And then when you get to the Speakerboxxx, The Love Below, that is by far their most commercially successful album. And that was like a Grammy Award winner for Album of the Year. They just basically conquered the music realm, the music world with that album. And then Andre basically retired from making music after that point, which I'm going to do a separate video about what surprises me about the fact that not that he retired and stepped away, but that he's stayed away. I know he pops back in for featured verses here and there, but he's largely stayed retired since, 2003? But most fans would, that were down from day one would normally pick one of those first three albums, Southern Playalistic, ATLiens, or Aquemini, especially Aquemini, as their favorite Outkast album, but it's their fourth and fifth albums that are the most commercially successful and that had their biggest singles, their biggest songs. Obviously with the Speakerboxxx and The Love Below, you've got Hey Ya, you've got Roses, and then you've got The Way You Move. Mega singles. These like hit #1 on the Billboard charts. And granted, ATLiens, the title track, Throw Your Hands in the Air, from the ATLiens album, and like Rosa Parks, those were big singles, but they weren't as big and as much crossover mega singles as those other ones that I mentioned. So when you can ask 10 different people, what is your favorite Outkast album? Or what are your 3 favorite Outkast songs? And you get a different response from just about everybody. Like, you're gonna have some people that say, album 1, album 2, album 3, all the way to 5. You're gonna have a lot of variety on what their best or what their top 2 albums are. To me, that's the mark of a outstanding and consistently outstanding artist. So if we're gonna talk about who have had the best bodies of works where there was no slippage, because what often happens is even the best artists might start off hot, right? So take like Nelly or DMX. DMX, I mean, his 3 album run with It's Dark and Hell is Hot, and then Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, and then there was X. All 3 of those, mega success. And then you got the Great Depression, and then all the way to Grand Champ. And then it started losing some of its luster. Same thing with Nelly. If you take like the Country Grammar debut and then the Nellyville album, you don't get any bigger in terms of success with your first 2 albums. but then you stick around long enough to where, you know, your music starts to cool off a bit, right? I mean, even like Eminem, I mean, he starts off with the Slim Shady LP, Marshall Mathers LP, and the Eminem Show. And then you could argue that it starts to, you know, by the time he gets to Encore, the 4th album, that was kind of a miss, right? And then, I mean, he's been a lyrical madman ever since. And his Recovery album was kind of a true return to form, album quality wise, but he's had some albums that didn't have the same type of critical success, for instance, down the line. So it's really hard to think of an artist who never really fell off. And yes, some of the reason why Outkast never fell off is because Andre retired at the height of their commercial success. But if you were to find another artist who's even in this discussion, who would it be? Now, Drake, he's got some hits, he's got some misses. I mean, for some reason, he gets critically crushed. You have a lot of people who love certain Drake songs and love his more lyrical stuff or love his commercial hits, but don't totally love all of his albums. You've got, I mean, Lil Wayne has had a tremendous body of work, you know, starting with The Block is Hot, but then it really started to pick up around the time of the Carter 1, then the Carter 2, and then the Drought and Leak series, and, you know, all the mixtape series, Dedications, No Ceilings, the Carter 3, one of the biggest and hottest albums ever. But, you know, he had some, you know, 500 Degrees, I don't think has as good a reputation as those others. And then when you take Jay-Z, now Jay-Z, when he had his first big run, every year he was dropping an album, from Reasonable Doubt, Volume 1, then the Hard Knock Life, then Life at Times of Sean Carter, and the Dynasty album, and then the Blueprint 2, all the way to his first retirement. You could argue that there was not one miss. I mean, some will say the Blueprint 2, but you could argue that he was hitting with every album, one album per year. Yes, he also did The Streets Is Watching pretty early in his career, the soundtrack, but every year he was dropping an album, and every year it was just getting hotter and hotter, and, you know, super high quality albums. But if you look at his entire body of work, yes, the American Gangster album / soundtrack, that was hot too. It pretty much in line with most of his stuff. But you had like the Kingdom Come album and maybe Magna Carta Holy Grail. Those two albums, I would argue, don't have the same reputation as, you know, that first stretch of albums, or even his latest album, 444. I think that 444 has a better reputation than Kingdom Come and Magna Carta Holy Grail. And I mean, obviously the Notorious B.I.G. only had 2 actual albums. Yes, they did the Born Again, I think, was it called Born Again, after he passed away? I don't count that. But 2 albums, I can't consider that along the lines of the artists who have like 4 or more albums. So with this particular conversation, we have to exclude Biggie's catalog because it's so short-lived. It was just Ready to Die, Life After Death, tremendous all-time classics, but it was only 2 albums. So because his life was taken so young, his career never had a chance to really fall off, right? Tupac, he had a few albums, and I mean, were there any misses? Would you say Strictly for My Ends was a miss, or Tupacalypse Now, or even the Thug Life album? Were any of those misses? I don't know, but they weren't album by album as consistent as Outkast. Now, the best of Tupac are like his Me Against the World album, All Eyes on Me, probably Machiavelli, but overall, I would still give the edge to Outkast. The Roots were on a great run with their first few albums, but let's see who would be in the discussion. And I want to do a follow-up eventually once I get your guys' response on who should even be in this conversation. You know, Ice Cube with his first 4 albums, you know, he would have been in the running, but he made enough albums over the years where you might have some lesser quality albums than his other stuff. I still think that he's super highly consistent, just not as consistent as Outkast. I mean, Outkast, again, when Aquemini dropped, that was arguably the best rap album of that year. ATLiens is an amazing album that actually ages pretty well over time. Go back and give ATLiens a listen from front to back. Even the album cuts like Mainstream or Wheels of Steel or Jazzy Bell, which actually that had a music video as well. And then obviously you've got Elevators, ATLiens, and then you've got what's that other one? Babylon. That's another very good album cut. But yeah, Outkast did not miss. And every time they released, I was thinking to myself, is this their best album yet? Because they were so packed from front to back with a bunch of just very interesting and outstanding songs. So I'm gonna ask one more time before I close out, who would be in the discussion? I would offer up Kendrick Lamar and A Tribe Called Quest. Tribe Called Quest started with People's Instinctive Travels, and then, you know, they had the Low End Theory, which is probably the greatest Tribe Called Quest album. Then they had Midnight Marauders, fantastic album. And then they had Beats, Rhymes, and Life, and then the Love Movement, and then that was it for, oh no, they came back years and years later, just a few years ago, with their, you know, with their album, which was a critical success. So you could argue that they didn't fall off with that last album. So maybe Tribe Called Quest is in that running. And then you would have, let's see, not the Wu-Tang Clan, because after, you know, you could argue after Wu-Tang Forever, I mean, people didn't like the W as much as they liked those first two Wu albums. I liked Iron Flag, their fourth album, but then after that, it was just, you know, you could tell that they weren't dialed in. They weren't focused in the same way they were back in the day. But I would also offer up Kendrick Lamar. If you look at his album by album track record, you could argue that every Kendrick Lamar is a classic or a near classic, which with each of his releases, I mean, we could probably like discard or at least exclude Overly Dedicated, that album. Let's start at Section 80 because he was still kind of a local rapper at the time of Overly Dedicated. So if you start with his breakthrough, Section 80, Good Kid, Mad City, To Pimp a Butterfly, Damn, and now Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, you could argue Kendrick Lamar has had the greatest album by album consistency out of anyone. LL Cool J had a great start, but he stuck around long enough to kind of be, it's not as good as his, you know, as his prior classics. And even out of his first few albums, was it Walking with the Panther that people didn't like as much as the stuff before and after it? Because remember when he came back with Mama Said Knock You Out, don't call it a comeback. So he might have had a miss or two somewhere even in that first few years. I know people who love Redman's body of work, but his later stuff wasn't as good as, you know, There Is a Dark Side and Muddy Waters. But yeah, Kendrick Lamar is certainly in the discussion. Let me know if there's anybody who comes to mind in your opinion where there was arguably no miss in their entire discography. Because as I see it right now, until we start thinking about this a little bit more thoroughly, I would say that it might, as it stands, be a three-man race or a three-artist race between Outkast, Kendrick Lamar, A Tribe Called Quest. Lupe Fiasco, I love his discography, but I can't say that it's as consistent as Outkast. I didn't love his Lasers album, for instance, as much as some of the others. And although I've loved his last couple of albums, you could argue that there were a miss or two within the catalog. But yeah, this is kind of an interesting, nuanced conversation to have. But let me know what your thoughts are on who has the most consistent discography of any rap artist. And I'm stopping short of saying the greatest discography because, you know, I'm not about to say Outkast definitively has a better discography than Jay-Z or than Drake. I mean, an argument can be made, but no, I mean, Jay-Z has released so much good music over the course of his career, you know, Eminem, and, you know, there are others. So I'm not going to call this the greatest discography. I'm just talking about per album quality. Consistency to the point where there is arguably no misses in the entire catalog. Because think about it, Outkast Southernplayalisticadillacmuzik got like 4.5 mics in the Source magazine, right? And then they got 5 mics on their third album, Aquemini. Remember that big boy line from Skewered on the Barbie? I gotta hit the source, I need my other half a mic because that Southernplayalisticadillacmuzik was a classic, right? So yeah, you'll be hard pressed to find a more consistent group. Ludacris has had very consistent output in terms of the album by album quality as well. Mobb Deep, their first few were very consistent. Yeah, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love hip hop like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.